thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me here today. Thank you very much for the introduction. I am going to be talking about a new model of niche construction that I've been working on with Mike Wade from Indiana. And it focuses on the inheritance and heritability of niche constructed traits. And Mike has worked for a long time on another type of model of heritable environmental changes, namely indirect genetic effects. So one of the aims of this project was to describe a model of niche construction that would be comparable with models of indirect genetic effects. So that's why we're using that framework as we move forward. Okay, so let's talk about niche construction. This is an audience that probably doesn't need to see a definition of niche construction. I can literally see all three of the authors of this niche construction book sitting in front of me. So I don't want to go too deeply into the definitions, but I wanted to make one point about the definitions that we typically use. So instead of showing you one definition, I'm going to show you two. And these are randomly chosen definitions from my database of papers, just chosen to make a point. So the first one is this paper by Gerbeau et al., and they said that niche construction is the process by which organisms construct important components of their local environments in ways that introduce novel selection pressures. And the second one is what I think is a lovely definition by Chisholm et al.'s recent paper in 2018, and they said that through niche construction, in addition to an evolutionary process of adapting to an environment, the environment can be brought closer to the organism. So it's quite a nice definition of niche construction. But the point that I want to draw out in these definitions is really this. So most definitions of niche construction, and not to mention the theoretical research that sort of underpins niche construction theory, focus on the environment, so the changes an organism makes to the environment, and on the knock-on effects for selection of those changes. And they don't generally tend to focus on inheritance or heritability of those niche constructed traits. Okay, so there's a couple of reasons why we might want to focus on heritability. The first and most obvious one is that if we focus on heritability, we get a new point of view. We can understand more about how niche construction works, the mechanics of niche construction. But I think also importantly, I think if we look at the heritability of these traits, we can also address some long-standing issues or criticisms of niche construction that are hard to tackle head-on with the frameworks that we have at the moment. Okay, so as we go through, I'm going to do three things in this talk. The first thing that I'm going to do is describe a model of niche construction based on the models of indirect genetic effects and ask the question, are indirect genetic effects and niche construction the same? So do we actually need any additional theory to describe niche construction and the evolutionary consequences of niche construction? Then I want to use that model to ask the question, can we make sense of heritability as we currently define it, we currently understand it for niche constructed traits and indeed traits with indirect genetic effects? And finally, I'm going to answer this question, which I've been asked a lot, and maybe you have if you're interested in niche construction. Well, what isn't niche construction? So I'm going to try and answer that question at the end. Okay, so let's talk about indirect genetic effects. So I'm going to go into some detail on indirect genetic effects models just to set up the structure of the niche construction model. I'm going to focus on three papers in particular. So the first is by Moore et al. In 1997. The second two are by Peter Bima. So Bima and Wade, 2008, and Bima as a sole author in 2011. And these are really different ways of modeling indirect genetic effects. But I'm going to draw from all of them. And it's worth noting at this point that the models of indirect genetic effects, as well as the subsequent models of niche construction, do suffer from some conceptual modeling issues. And you can read about those in this paper by Peter Bima in 2014, if you're interested. So they suffer from some of those issues and also issues related to the assumptions of quantitative genetic models in general, and I'm sure some that are unique to niche construction that you can tell me about in the questions. Okay, so this is the idea of indirect genetic effects. Many important phenotypes or interesting phenotypes are expressed in social interactions, or those phenotypes interact with the phenotypes of other individuals. So the value that these traits take depends critically on the social interaction, and some of these traits can't even be identified outside of the interaction, but they still evolve, and we still need a theory to describe their evolution. So just to put this in some sort of context, we could talk about something like aggression. So if aggression is the phenotype that we're interested in, If you're expressing an aggressive phenotype, you might be less likely to be more aggressive if you meet an individual who's considerably larger than you, or more likely to be more aggressive if you meet an individual who's smaller. So in that way, the aggression phenotype is being mediated or modulated by this body size phenotype. So these social interactions are the kind of things that we're thinking about. Okay, so these are trait-based evolutionary models. In these kinds of models, we generally have a phenotype. We call it Z. And the phenotype, the value that the phenotype takes is a linear combination of additive genetic effects. So that's the effect of every gene that contributes to the phenotype, and an environmental deviation. So these are, on a population level, they have a mean of 0. They're random effects that just affect your phenotype. So again, to just try and get some sort of grounding, if the phenotype I'm interested in is how high can I jump, then that phenotype will be the sum of the effect of the genes controlling, say, muscle growth in my legs, something like that, and some environmental perturbations. So, for example, is it windy and is it stopping me from jumping as high as I otherwise could do? So some sort of environmental mediation. And then we can move on and we can add to this model a social interaction. Okay, so again, we have the phenotype, that's Z. It's a combination of the additive genetic effect, the environmental deviation, and now the social environment as well. And we can take that social environment term and we can replace it with the phenotype of the social partner, and we can expand that out so it looks like this. Okay, so we've got the phenotype now, how high can I jump, is now a linear combination of the sum of the effect of the genes controlling my muscle growth, my environment, my social partner's muscle growth, and the environment of the social partner. Okay, so the value of the phenotype, or how I can jump, has now been changed by that social interaction. Okay, so I'm going to stop at this point and just say, before I describe mathematically this model of indirect genetic effects, I've chosen a model of indirect genetic effects that separates the affected phenotype from the affecting phenotype. So a lot of the modeling that's been done on niche construction separates niche constructing locus from a recipient locus. And there's some mathematical reasons why this is helpful for us to do, and I'll get onto that a little bit later. But a conceptual reason for doing this is to maintain that separation for comparison with the niche construction theory that we currently work with. Okay. So this is our indirect genetic effects model. We've got two individuals, individual A and individual B. Both of those have two phenotypes, Z1 and Z2. And what we're saying here is that the phenotype, the expression of the phenotype Z2 in individual B affects the expression of the phenotype Z1 in individual A, and that's mediated by a parameter psi. So that's the strength of the interaction, and the reverse is true. So individual A is affecting the Z1 phenotype of individual B. Okay, and we can write this out mathematically. So these are just the equations that we've seen before, and you can extend it out to look like this. So this is a description of the phenotype that's affected by an indirect genetic effect. So the next thing that we want to know, once we've got a description of this phenotype, is how does the phenotype we've just described respond to selection? So how does evolution happen? And the way that we can model the response to selection, and an important thing to bear in mind when we start to model a response to selection, is that the response of trait 1 to selection depends on direct selection pressure on trait 1 and selection on trait 2, because they're correlated. And if you want to know a little bit more about how this works and why this works, this model comes from Landy in 1979, so you can take a look at that. If you want to know a little bit more about how this is applied to indirect genetic effects, there's a paper by Moore et al. In 1997 and Chevrolet and Moore 1994, where they apply these to indirect genetic effects and maternal effects, respectively. But for now, we're just going to take a look at the equation. And this equation is telling us that the response to selection is the covariance between the breeding value, which I'm going to define right now. The breeding value of an individual is the direct and indirect average effect of its own genes, and that's a definition of for total breeding value that I took from this paper by Bima in 2011. And average effect is just average effect as defined by Fisher in 1930. Okay, so what this is saying is it's taking the covariance between this breeding value and the trait value and multiplying it by the selection gradient. And that's done for trait 1 and for trait 2. And what this equation is really telling us is how much of the phenotype is amenable to change by selection, and then multiplying that by the selection gradient. So just subjecting that to selection. And that's done for trait 1 and for trait 2. Okay, and we can take these, expand these equations, and we can take these covariances, and we end up with an equation that looks like this third one. And what this is really telling us is that the response to selection is a function of the additive genetic variance in trait 1, that's G11, the genetic covariance between traits 1 and 2, that's G12, and the additive genetic variance in trait 2, which is G22. Okay, and we can assign some values to the parameters in our model here, and we can graph this. So on the x-axis here is the effect of the interaction on the phenotype, that's psi. On the y-axis is a phenotypic response to selection. So here, as a comparison, I'm using the Landy 1979 correlated characters model. There's no social interaction there, so it's a straight line. So it's a solid straight line. And when you add the social interaction, it's no longer a straight line. So what's interesting here is that depending on the value of psi, you can get a response to selection that's much faster than you would have expected in the absence of an interaction, or much slower, depending on the value of psi. Okay, so we're 11 minutes in. We can talk about niche construction now. Okay, so to make a niche construction model, we're going to make some assumptions that will make sure that the niche construction models retain some features of niche construction that we really like and that are really useful to us. So one of the great benefits of niche construction is that it's very applicable, particularly to ecological questions. So we want to maintain some ecological realism, or maintain the possibility of introducing ecological realism into these models. So to do that, the first assumption that I want to make is that the interaction is a function of resource abundance, resource depletion, and we want to include a way, or allow the models to represent, for example, how resources are shared or experienced by individuals. If we focus on this resource production type niche construction, which I will today, although other models are possible, obviously, we need to be aware that resources are shared locally. So in indirect genetic effects models in general, interactions are pairwise, although some include neighborhood interactions. But for a niche construction model, where interactions are happening via a resource, and we need to be aware that we have neighbor interactions that include the actor itself. So we also need to take account of our own niche construction. And obviously, ecological inheritance is a key feature of many of the most interesting examples of niche construction. So we need to know, and we need to include, what the effect of previous generations of niche construction are on the phenotypes in this generation. And finally, I want to include the effect of relatives. So a lot of the models of IGs also assume that interacting individuals are unrelated, although there is work that dives quite deeply into the importance of relatedness and multi-level selection, but you can take a look at that independently. So for our niche construction model, we're going to include the relatedness among group members. Okay, we also make some assumptions that just make our lives a little bit easier. So one of the most crucial assumptions that we're going to make is that genetic variances and covariances remain constant over time. And that's the same thing as saying that we're assuming selection is weak, many genes contribute to the phenotypes, we're only looking at short-term evolution. We're also assuming that the niche constructing trait is separate from the niche constructed trait. So I mentioned a conceptual reason for doing this earlier on, and this is the mathematical reason. When we separate these things, it means that Z1, so the phenotype, is not cascading as it would be in a maternal effects or a grandmaternal effects model. And you can read a little bit about the issues with cascading inside those models in this Kuiper et al. 2014 paper. If you're interested in that, that's a maternal effects model. And I assume that relatedness is constant over time. So I'm mentioning these assumptions particularly because as I was looking through the abstracts for this conference, I noticed that not only is Bram here, but Rebecca is also here. And I think tomorrow Rebecca's going to be talking in particular about why this first assumption is not one that I should be making. So if you want to know more about how to destroy my model, you can go and see Rebecca talk. I'm sure you can go and see Rebecca talk tomorrow at 2:30. Okay, so let's take a look at this model of indirect genetic effects, and let's turn it into a model of niche construction. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to say that individuals are not interacting directly anymore, they're interacting via a resource. Okay, so here's our resource. It's a patchy resource that is occurring in the environment. We want to have not just pairwise interactions, but neighbor interactions. So here I've got a subpopulation of 5 individuals who are interacting. We need to take account of time. So everything that's inside this bubble is happening in the present. So that's the current generation. And what we're saying is that the expression of Z2 contributes to this resource landscape. And the resource landscape, in turn, affects the expression of Z1. And again, we're mediating that with this parameter psi. And then we want to think about what happened in previous generations and how does that affect our resources. So we can go back to time t-1, and we can say that the expression of the Z2 phenotypes in t-1 contributed to this resource landscape, but that contribution is decaying at a rate mu. And we can go further back. So we can go back to t-tau, and we can look at how they contribute to the resource landscape and how that contribution decays. Okay, so I want to say something really quickly about these. These seem like very small parts of this model, but these are actually where we can insert ecological realism and maintain that ecological realism in this framework. So manipulating the form of these mu's, at the moment they're constants, but they don't need to be constants, they could be functions. If we know something about how the resources degrade over time, we can put that into the model at that point. And that can allow us to change the resource dynamics that we see in the model. And manipulating the psi can allow us to change the ways in which individuals experience the resources. So the effect that the resources have and how they're shared. Okay, so let's look at it mathematically. So this is the equation that we get when we sum everything up. So it's got the same kind of form that we saw before. We've got a phenotype. It's a function of the direct additive contribution and the direct environmental deviation. This is the psi. This is telling us the strength of the effect of the resource on the phenotype. This is the social effect, so the effect of an individual's neighbors on the resource landscape and so on their phenotype. And we can sum this effect over the contributions of all relevant generations, including the effect of resource degradation. Okay. And we can do the same thing with this model that we did with the previous model. So we can calculate the covariance between the breeding value and the phenotype and multiply it by the selection gradients. So for our indirect genetic effect, we've already seen this equation, and that's what we get. And for the niche construction, we get this absolutely beautiful equation up here. But we don't have to look at it for too long, because we can just plot it on our graph. So here again, this is the same plot that you've seen before. So on the x-axis is the effect, now not of the social interaction, but of the resource on the phenotype psi, and the phenotypic response to selection. And these are the two lines that we saw before. So the Landy 1979 correlated characters model and the Moore et al. 1997 indirect genetic effects model. And I'm going to put the niche construction model on top. Okay. So this is the niche construction model with 2 generations of niche construction. And this is the niche construction model with 20 generations of niche construction. Okay, so there are some robust patterns here that I want to draw attention to. The first is that the response to selection is different. It can be both higher and lower than expected in the absence of niche construction or expected in the absence of any interaction. And the relationship between the resource and the response to selection is usually nonlinear. So what we really have here is a quadratic in psi, and that's why we're getting this this shaped graph. So it's usually that shape, it's always different. But these results do depend critically on the number of interacting individuals. So this is a neighborhood of 5, as I mentioned, but you can change the size of that neighborhood, and it changes the size of the effect quite substantially. And the interaction between mu and the number of generations of niche construction that are considered. And what this really means, I think, biologically, is that the way in which a resource is shared, the way in which a resource depletes over time, can drastically change the response to selection of a niche constructed trait. Okay, So I'm going to move on a little bit and talk about what these kinds of models of phenotypic change mean for heritability. And I'm going to answer this question that I posed at the start, which is, can we make sense of the heritability of niche constructed traits sort of using this framework? It's just a tiny bit about heritability before I dive into niche construction. So heritability is really the idea that some resemblances between individuals are a result of shared genes and some aren't. We're very interested to know what the proportion of this variance that's attributable to genetics might be, because heritability describes the potential of a trait to respond to selection. So how amenable are traits to manipulation? And because this is the definition of heritability, it's a very important concept for things like breeding programs and, of course, for understanding evolution in natural populations. But it's mostly used in the context of artificial selection. Okay, so mathematically, we can describe heritability as the proportion of total phenotypic variance that's due to additive genetic variance. You usually see it written like this. This is narrow sense heritability. And in the terminology that we've been using, this is what it would look like. So it's the additive genetic variance in our niche constructed trait or our focal trait divided by the phenotypic variance, and we can expand the phenotypic variance. And the components of phenotypic variance are genetic variance and environmental variance. So that's what we're looking at here. But this section on heritability is not really about modeling. This section on heritability is kind of a word of caution, because there are lots of definitions of heritability that are used. They're used interchangeably because in typical quantitative genetic models like these, they generate the same results. But when we introduce indirect genetic effects, when we introduce niche construction to an even greater extent, they are not the same thing anymore. So this is the definition we've seen. Heritability is the proportion of total phenotypic variance that is due to additive genetic variance. That's no longer the same thing as saying that heritability is the ratio of the variance in the breeding values to the phenotypic variance, gives you different results. In turn, that is no longer equivalent to saying that the heritability is the ratio of the heritable component of phenotypic variance to the full phenotypic variance, completely different thing. And finally, that is in turn not equivalent to saying that heritability is the ratio of the covariance between the breeding value and the phenotype to the phenotypic variance. So traditionally, these would have given you all the same result, and they could be used interchangeably, but that's no longer the case when we introduce niche construction. Okay, so just to illustrate this a little bit, I'm going to take these two definitions, and I'm going to plot the results of heritability for all of our models that we've looked at, including the niche construction one, to take a look at how different they can be. Okay, so I'm going to start with this one. So the first thing that we need to do to get at the heritability is to calculate the phenotypic variance. So here on the x-axis is the effect of the resource on the phenotype again, and on the y-axis is the phenotypic variance. And what you'll notice about the phenotypic variance of niche constructed traits is that it's massive. And it's usually a lot larger than either for indirect genetic effects or for just general correlated evolution models. But this is not something I think that I would expect to be a kind of robust pattern in nature if you went out to look for it, because of selection will modulate this phenotypic variance as well. But all else being equal, the phenotypic variance is larger. So this is what we get when we calculate the heritability in this way. So again, on the x-axis is the effect of the resource on the phenotype, and on the y-axis is heritability. So this is a measure of heritability that we can get again. Just to note that the heritability of niche construction and the heritability of indirect genetic effects is quite different to anything you would get in the absence of an interaction. I'm going to move on to calculate heritability in this way. So the ratio of the covariance between the breeding value and the phenotype to the phenotypic variance. So again, this is the phenotypic variance, is exactly the same thing that you just saw. And this is the new heritability measure. And I'm just going to put those side by side so you can take a look. So what you'll notice immediately is that sometimes the shapes of these curves are changing, but certainly the numbers involved in these are changing. So depending on how we define heritability, we're getting completely different results with these models. Okay, so the take-home message from all of these models, including the heritability models, are these really. Niche construction is quantitatively and qualitatively different to both the simple IgE model, the indirect genetic effects model, and to traditional quantitative genetic models of correlated evolution. It's different. The effect of niche construction and IGEs on heritability means that the traits that respond to niche construction or to indirect genetic effects might evolve considerably more slowly or much faster than we would expect if we assumed no interactions. In turn, this means that designing an effective artificial selection program involving niche constructed traits might be very, very tricky, as indeed would understanding the effect of natural selection in natural ecosystems without understanding the precise form of niche construction that we're looking at. And we really need to be cautious about the definitions that we're using, a lot more cautious than we had to be in the past. And we need to be especially careful about the assumed equivalence of different definitions in this context. Ultimately, what I want to say about these models is this. We need an understanding of the form and consequences of niche construction to properly understand the evolution of some very important traits, both in terms of selection, and as I said, I think we have a good idea of, or we're getting a handle on the effect of niche construction on selection, but also on inheritance. So without developing models like this one to a much higher standard, we will make mistakes, and sometimes our estimates might be just a little bit wrong, but sometimes we could miss something significant that could really substantially improve our understanding of the systems that we're studying. Okay, so with the 10 minutes I have left, that was speedy, I'm going to try and answer this question. What isn't niche construction? So this is a question that I think I've been asked in maybe every coffee room of every university that I have gone into to discuss niche construction. I think it's usually posed as a facetious question. I'm not sure I've ever been asked it in any seriousness, but there is a kernel, I think, of something very interesting in this question. So the question can be rephrased as, isn't niche construction defined so broadly as to render it a useless concept for evolutionary biologists? And I think this question has its roots in a two reviews of the niche construction book. So the first by Dawkins in 2004 and the second by Brodie in 2005. And this is Brodie quoting Dawkins. So Dawkins favors a division between what he calls niche changing so niche changing in his mind is any changes in the environment that's brought about as a byproduct of an organism's way of life. And he contrasts that with what he grudgingly accepts might be niche construction, but would rather call an extended phenotype, and that is active engineering of the environment. So he wants these things separated. And Brodie goes one further and he asks, well, what's the harm in lumping niche construction and niche changing together? And his answer is covariance. So he says, if evolution is a statistical process, covariance is surely its engine. And the contention here is that some examples of niche construction have this engine, and some examples of niche construction lack it. And we need to be aware of those differences. So what I want to say about this is that I think from the perspective of heritability or models of inheritance that focus on inheritance, I think we can start to pull these apart and to really understand the differences between different types of niche construction and whether we should be concerned about this problem. So I'm going to do this by looking through the lens of the Breeder's equation. So this is the Breeder's equation. It's just another way of describing the change of a phenotype over a generation. And this is saying that the change in the phenotype is the narrow sense heritability that we've seen multiplied by the selection differential. So this is another measure of selection. And we can expand this out. And when we expand it out, it looks a little bit like this. So this is just the covariance in the breeding value multiplied by the covariance between what is essentially the fitness landscape and the phenotype. And that's divided by the phenotypic variance P. Okay, and then we're going to fill in this table. So this table is going to tell us what part of this Breeder's equation, the niche construction that's happening, is changing. What conditions can we expect to see this kind of niche construction? And what are the evolutionary consequences of those changes? So the first column, or the first row that I want to fill in, is this. This is what I want to call weak niche construction and what I think Dawkins and Brodie might call niche changing. And this is where the niche construction changes the recipient phenotype only. So it's just changing these Z values. When you change the phenotypic value, you would generally change the phenotypic variance, so I'm going to include that here. I contend that this is only possible in interspecies interactions with strictly no feedback. I've done some maths that suggests that any feedback involved in this system whatsoever will push us down this table. So I would contend firstly that it's only possible in this condition, and I would contend that it's extremely rare. Nevertheless, it does have evolutionary consequences because the recipient species fitness is altered through phenotypic changes. Okay. Then we can think about niche construction that changes the recipient's fitness landscape through, for example, ecological perturbations. This might be the kind of niche construction that we're more used to thinking about. So it just changes the fitness landscape, or it could change the phenotype and the fitness landscape, some combination of those things. And this is possible, I think, in interspecies and intraspecies interactions. And the evolutionary consequence of this is that the recipient species fitness is altered through ecological fitness and through landscape changes. Okay. And finally, I want to go on to what I'm going to call strong niche construction, what Brodie and Dawkins might just call niche construction. And this is where the niche construction changes not just the recipient phenotype, not just the fitness landscape, but the breeding values. And once you change the breeding values, you change the structure of the heritability of the traits. This is possible, I think, in interspecies interactions with feedback, and that can be direct or indirect feedback, and in intraspecies interactions, which I think will be most of our examples. And the evolutionary consequence is that the structure of the recipient's traits' heritability is altered, and heritable environmental changes in a very true sense become possible. Okay. So the take home from this is really that different types of niche construction have different effects on the expression of phenotypes. They have different effects on selection pressures and fitness landscapes. They will generate vastly different genotype-phenotype covariances, but crucially, all of these types of niche construction do have evolutionary consequences, even from the weakest to the strongest niche construction. And to my mind, because of this, I think they're rightly understood as different instances of the same process, but with different effects. And I think if we look through the lens of heritability and through the lens of this breeder's equation, we can start to pull apart and understand more clearly what those different effects might be and what the similarities are. Okay, so I'm going to swing back around, and I'm going to try and answer these questions that I posed at the start. So the first question is, are models of indirect genetic effects enough? Do we, in fact, need new modeling to describe niche construction in this framework? So they're not the same. They do have many features in common, and I'd argue that actually mathematically the niche construction model is a generalization of an indirect genetic effects model. So to the extent that we can improve our understanding of the niche construction model, we'll also improve, I think, our understanding of indirect genetic effects. Can we make sense of heritability as we currently understand it for niche constructed traits? No, or probably more optimistically, not yet. We've got a lot of work left to do on that, but I think it could be very interesting to try and sort that out. And finally, what isn't niche construction? Well, in answer to this question, I would say that niche construction is everywhere, but that's actually okay, so long as we're aware of the effect of niche construction on selection, which I think we do understand, on heritability, which we definitely don't understand, and we understand how the relevant variances and covariances are generated and how they're used by selection. Okay, so that's pretty much everything that I had to say. I want to really quickly acknowledge my collaborator, Mike Wade, and I'd like to say thank you to all of the institutions that hosted us while we were doing this project, as well as the funding for my last postdoc from the John Templeton Foundation. And I'd like to thank Anne Candler and Dominic Defner, who are fantastic colleagues who listened to me talk about niche construction, and Kevin and Mark for also listening to me talk probably a little bit too much about this model. Okay, and I'll take any questions that you have.